Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about another game that I recently played in the Bishop's Opening, which is goes along with this series that I started. There's a slightly different opening variation here, and there's some trickiness to it as well that I want to go over with you guys. So hopefully you learn a couple things, and also you guys are going to have the opportunity to correct some of the mistakes that I made as well. I'm going to point them out as I go through the game and see if you guys can outsmart me and make some better moves. All right. So let's get started. And the bishop's opening starts with pawn to e4, bishop to c4. And here, my opponent plays bishop to c5, which is also a fairly common response to the bishop's opening. So let's see, how I approach this one. So I'm going to play d4. That's what I played. And this is a temporary sacrifice of a pawn here, but it gives you some initiative, and there's a little bit of trickiness to it as well. So first question for you guys. There's two ways for black to take the pawn here. One of these ways is accurate, and one is actually slightly a mistake. So pause the video if you would like, and think about which way you would take this pawn if you were black. Okay, so my opponent plays the correct response, which is taking with the bishop. Taking with the pawn is a little bit of a mistake, and let's see why. So if black takes with the pawn here, then white has this temporary bishop sacrifice, capturing the pawn on f7, and really the black king really has to take this bishop. And after the black king takes, you can hit him with queen h5 check, and you're going to pick up the material here. Now black can move his king to kind of get out of the way, not here. But that would also be a mistake, because if he does, then he's going to run into check again after I capture it. So the best move for black would be to play here, blocking it. And now we're even on material, but black has lost the right to castle. And on top of that, I'm attacking this pawn as well on d4. So this is just generally speaking a good position for white to be in. So that's why you don't really want to take with the pawn if you're black here. So he plays the correct move and he takes with the bishop. And now we play knight to f3, putting some pressure here and developing. And we don't necessarily have to take this bishop right away. But after we see black playing a very logical move here, knight f6, developing, preparing to castle, now's a perfect time to take this bishop. And you'll see why in a second, because that's what I do. I take the bishop. Black is forced to retake. And you'll notice from a move or two ago, black was one move away from castling. And we're going to see how black here is prevented from castling the entire game, which really leads to his downfall here. So the reason why you can take the bishop after knight f6 is because after the pawn is forced to take back, we can start harassing this knight on f6. So we play pawn e5, and you can see that there isn't really a great position for the knight to go to. The knight can't go to either of these locations. It's really depressing having to move the knight back to where he started, which actually would be not a bad move here. But my opponent doesn't do any of those things. Instead, he decides to play queen e7, which is probably his first mistake of the game. The reason why this looks like it works is because you're pinning the pawn here. Now, I've done this, played, not in this exact position, but in similar type positions. I've played this move queen e7 before, taking advantage of this pin. And it's very dangerous. So if I had just any word of advice for you guys playing with black here, just always double check this move queen e7. It runs into a lot of issues if you're not careful. So the problem with this move, in this particular position, there's two of them. The first is that let's just remove this pawn from the board. Pretend it doesn't exist. This queen and this king are lined up on the same file here, which is always very dangerous, because that means this queen is pinned if this pawn wasn't here. The second reason why it doesn't work in this position is because white is one move away from castling. So combining that with the fact that this king is lined up with the queen, after you castle, white castles, black can't actually take this pawn. Because if black takes this pawn, well, guess what? His queen is trapped. And yeah, he might be able to block it, but you're going to lose material for this. So that is something that really you have to be very wary of. So I went ahead and castled after he played this move because this pawn still isn't really under threat because of the fact that he hasn't castled yet. So now that he still hasn't castled, he still has to deal with this problem of this pawn attacking the knight. So I basically got a free developing move here, free castling. So now he's got to move the knight. He doesn't want to move it backwards, so he actually moves it to e4. And you may have noticed that this pawn, black's pawn, was under attack this whole time. Well, now it's the perfect time to take this pawn, because once we recapture this pawn, we're threatening the knight once again. If we weren't threatening the knight, black might be able to have a free developing move here, but we're not going to let him do that. So now he's got to move him again. And he moves him to c5. And I continue to put the pressure on, which is the title of this video. And I play b4. Again, not really many great positions for his knight to go to. So let's see. I think probably the best move here probably would have been knight to e6. And if he played that, I was expecting to play that. I was going to go somewhere maybe like queen g4, potentially trading for the knight and weakening, taking a pawn here. But instead, my opponent plays knight to c6. Another mistake, and here's your first opportunity to fix my chess play. So, what's the best move for white here? Think about it. Pause the video. What move would you play with white after seeing that move? Okay, so I played queen to g4, and what I was thinking here is I'm pressuring this pawn here, and I'm obviously also still providing this pressure with the knight on c5 with my pawn. Now, the problem is that black can kind of take care of both of these problems with the same move. That would be moving the knight away from the pawn back to e6, defending this pawn. So at that point, this attack would kind of fizzle out if he sees that move. Unfortunately for him, he doesn't see the move. The correct move for white here, just to go back, let's see if you guys got it right. It's actually, I mean, I don't want to say, it's pretty egregious for me to miss this, but the correct move is simply taking the knight here, because we've got the pawn defending, so you're basically winning a free piece there. But, of course, me and my infinite wisdom missed that move, and luckily for me, black misses this move that I was just going over. Instead, he takes this pawn here on b4, and I think he saw the fact that this pawn was also very weak, along with my rook being pretty immobile. And I think that's what kind of led him to play this move. But the problem with that move is that my attack is more direct. It's quicker, and it's also more dangerous to black's king than his would be to my king. So I ignore that, and I just take this pawn here on g7. He's obviously has to react to this. If he doesn't, I'm winning the rook with check, and his whole position is just going to fall apart. So only one real move for black here. He brings him back to f6, defending. Now, if this queen weren't here on e7, and in some variations of the bishop's opening, oftentimes or sometimes you can play a really nasty move here, which is bishop to h6. If this queen wasn't defending this square already, that could be something that potentially you can use in some of your games, because that adds an attacker to this rook and basically threatens checkmate very quickly on the next move. But in this position, it doesn't really do anything because of the queen being here. But we'll continue. So I played knight to a3. I'm sorry. So I wanted to defend this pawn. Turns out this move isn't the most accurate move. There's actually a better move, and you will see it in a second after black plays his move, which is h5. So in continuing with the keeping on the pressure here, you may have noticed a much better move than moving my knight here. And that move is bishop to g5. I can't really explain the h5 move here. I think it's kind of inexplicable. I guess he's trying to save a pawn, but when you're in this position here, you're obviously not castling anytime soon. You've got a lot of pieces in the area kind of bearing down on you. You've got to think bigger than just trying to save a pawn. You've got to think about the safety of your king and just not completely losing your position. And black plays this move, and it allows me to finally play this move, which I should have seen a move before, which is bishop to g5. Now, this is such a powerful move because it's keeping the pressure on, and there's really nowhere for this queen to go without, sacrificing herself. Turns out the best move here is actually trading the queen for the bishop. And that's because of this pawn here, which we're going to see how it aids in my attack in a second. So the only move here for black, seemingly, to save this queen is playing f6. Because, like I said, there's nowhere for the queen to go. So after black plays f6, he opens up a check for me here on the king. And that's important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it kind of forces the king into a corner again, where he's got no free squares. And secondly, in my mind, I didn't want to trade queens here. With all this pressure on the king, with these pieces moved forward, I don't want to offer him, the ability to kind of relieve some of the tension of the attack here. So I don't want to trade the queens. So I hit him with the check. He moves his king out of the way. You'll notice that this queen and this king are lined up again. And now we reach the position in the thumbnail, which is, I've got 3 ways to take this pawn, and what is the correct way? So, again, if you guys want to pause the video and think about it for a minute, how would you take this pawn back if you're white? Okay, so I played bishop captures. Now we're going to go through the other 2 options here because actually they're both very viable. The best move is actually to take with the pawn. And that's because, again, this queen doesn't have many places to go. And so let's say the most obvious move here, queen moves backwards, offering a queen trade, let's say, but then you just push the pawn forward, and now you're going to lose the queen anyway, because the queen has to block. And now this game is just absolutely lost for black. So let's go back. I mean, if the queen goes anywhere else, it doesn't really matter where the queen goes. We're gonna hit black with check here, and this is winning, immense material and just winning the game outright. So, again, I guess what has to happen here is when the pawn takes, when you open up this check, the queen basically has to block. There's no way around it because there's nowhere else that the king can go. This pawn is covering the e8 square. So that would have been the best move. Now, I immediately wrote off queen taking here because why would you trade the queen when you have the rook take? But the rook actually can't take here for the exact same reason. And this just shows how crazy this position is here. A lot of it has to do with this bishop, this diagonal really being, taken up by this beautiful bishop on c4. So if black takes with the rook, seemingly winning material as well, again, you're going to take with the pawn. The queen has to move, and the queen can't stop the progress of the pawn. And that's really important because progressing the pawn not only moves the pawn one step closer to promoting, but it also opens up the check that we just talked about. So because the queen can't move here, let's see the queen moves back. Well, guess what? You're hit with check again. And, not only is this winning the queen, but after the queen moves out of the way, what's better than winning a queen is checkmate. Because this queen is pinned, is stuck, planted here, and she can't actually guard both of these checks at once. So that's just checkmate. All right, so a lot of different ways to win there. I guess I took the less clear way, which is taking with the bishop. I saw this lineup. It still forces a favorable trade for me, a rook for a bishop. And you can see that I have this very advanced passed pawn here. No pawns on either side of him. Really, a dangerous position. And that pawn should be promoting shortly. So now my opponent has to move the queen because obviously the queen's under attack. Moves the queen to f8. And I thought for a while here. It turns out the best move would have been forcing the queen trade, which I thought about. Now the reason that's so powerful, let's say I move my queen here and he takes it. Well, there's nothing stopping this pawn from promoting. So it's very powerful to do that. Now instead of playing that move, I played rook e1. I really wanted to trap the king here, not let him get out and create more pressure down the middle of the board here. So that's what I played. My opponent moves his knight back, kind of cutting off this line, and I immediately trade. Now, the other benefit of trading here is it opens up another rook here to get into the action for me. And we can see how how constricted black is here with the pieces in play, with this pawn so far advanced, just very dangerous. So I assumed he was actually going to block with the bishop. So if he blocked with the bishop, I saw taking this pawn here with the rook, just totally breaking it open, because this bishop, again, would be pinned if he would have done that. But instead, he actually plays a better move, which is blocking with the knight. Now I play pawn to c4 because this knight's pinned. And yes, black goes ahead and takes that knight on a3 that I had there from the very beginning. That knight was really my only piece that wasn't in the game and really wasn't contributing at all to this attack. So I was totally fine with that. Another interesting position here, mistake I made, which you guys can also think about for a second. So we've got this knight hanging. How should it be taken? There's two different ways to take it. There's an obvious way, and there's a way that you might see if you think about it for a minute or two. Think about why maybe that might not be the best move here for white. So pause the video, think about it if you want. Okay, so the correct move is actually taking with the rook for the simple reason that it comes with check. And the problem is, yeah, you traded the rook for the knight, but guess what? You hung checkmate for black. So basically, white can't take this rook back, and it's just, you know, devastating. But of course, you know, I take with the pawn because it's the obvious move. And again, if my opponent takes here, it's checkmate. So he can't even take with the pawn either. So he plays pawn to c6, and I take back. Not only do I take the pawn here, but I also open up the check on my opponent's king. And at this point, the game is, you know, obviously pretty much over. I play e7 here because I'm trying to cut off the queen's access to possibly come back and defend at any point. And I'm just going to go ahead and ignore that bishop move, promote, force this trade here. And after he takes my rook, I take back, and I'm threatening all kinds of checks here as well with my queen and checkmates. So black plays queen to c3. I guess he's trying to go after the pawn here. And for the final time in the video now, you can pause it, find the best move. This one could be the worst mistake that I made in the game. So think about it. What move should white play here? It's not really a question of what the best move is here. So think about it. And all right, so the correct move is queen to d8 because that's checkmate. Oops, hanging the checkmate in one here. So the point is, obviously, when you go here, you're cutting off the king's only exit out. So when I'm up this much material, I'm up, you know, a full rook, plus I've got this pawn here. I immediately thought about, oh, I'm just going to try to trade queens, force a queen trade, which is exactly what I did. I hit him with the check here on e7. And of course, if he went back, this is one thing I did see. If he goes back here, well, then we've got mate, you know, in a number of ways. So I knew he was forced to go to b6. And then I hit him with check again, kind of double attacking the queen here, forcing that. And basically the game is over at this point. He makes one more move, but so my rook's cutting off his supply here. I mean, I could, if you guys know, you know, endgame techniques, some simple ones, you would know that you can win just with a rook up. So king and rook beat just king. But of course, also I'm about to get another queen here, and there's not much you can do about it. So he resigned in this position. Yeah. So let me know in the comments if you guys got any of those, you know, corrections to my play. I think there was maybe 3 or 4 of them that you guys figured out that could have improved my game there. I think if we go back to the beginning of the game, I think the big takeaway here is just the amount of pressure that I was able to put on him. So even from this point on, from this move on, many of the moves he was forced to make. So after I take the bishop, he's forced to take the bishop back, right? Otherwise, he's losing a piece. And after that, he's forced to address this pawn push, right? And again, after this castling, he's forced to address this pawn attacking his knight, and he can't do it by capturing the pawn. Again, he's forced to move the knight. and he's continually being put into forcing positions here. Now, I'll say that the last non-forcing move here was, which is why moving my knight out in this corner was probably one of the biggest mistakes I made in the game. It's giving him some breathing room. But after h5, again, forced moves. Playing the bishop out here, forcing the pawn push. Check, obviously, literally a forcing move. And again, just continuing to force. So, I think it's really a great example, again, of the bishop's opening, because part of that was a trickery of the opening. Putting my opponent into this position, forcing him to play really accurate moves, which he couldn't find, in order to maintain equality in the game. So, great showcase of the bishop's opening again. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any questions about anything, and thanks for tuning in.